on Housing Landscape 2015, Housing Affordability for Working Households. During this webinar today, you will hear about key findings from this year's Housing Landscape Report. Joining me on the webinar is the report co-author, Mindy Alt, a research associate here at the National Housing Conference. My name is Janet Viveros, and I'm a senior research associate here at NHC. Before we get started, I'd like to thank Capital One for sponsoring NHC's webinar series. And thanks also to NeighborWorks America for funding Housing Landscape 2015. Any opinions or errors, however, are ours alone. Before we begin the webinar, I have a few more introductory notes. First, let's address technical difficulties. While we hope the webinar runs smoothly for everyone, we all know this doesn't always happen. If you run into any technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the GoToWebinar help menu or visit support.citrixonline.com. Now let's cover another frequent question. Is this webinar being recorded? Yes, we are recording this webinar, and we'll make an archived copy of the webinar available when we email everyone after the link is available, along with the original landscape report. Now, let's move on to Housing Landscape. As I mentioned, today's webinar is a discussion of Housing Landscape 2015, NHC's annual report on housing affordability for working households. Our report includes our analysis of the most recent data from the Census Bureau's American Community Survey on income, housing costs, and housing affordability. In our analysis, we focus on low and moderate income working households, both renters and owners. We use the term working households to describe households where members work at least an average of 20 hours a week and earn no more than 120% of area median income. Households that are underemployed or unemployed are not captured in our report. We focus on working households in this report in order to increase awareness of the struggles that face households who are employed and working when it comes to finding housing they can afford. In considering housing affordability, we specifically look at working households with severe housing cost burdens. A housing cost burden is when a household is spending at least half their income on their housing. We would consider them severely housing cost burdened. Typically, housing is considered to be affordable if households are spending 30% of their household income on their housing costs. So the households we're looking at fall well outside the affordable range. When households are spending at least half of their income on housing, they have to cut back on other parts of their budget, particularly on items that are essential like food, health care, child care, and transportation. In Housing Landscape 2015, we specifically look at housing affordability trends between 2010 and 2013, the most recent data available from the American Community Survey, to get a sense of how affordability has been impacted by the economic recovery. The report also provides housing affordability data for all 50 states and the District of Columbia, and the 50 largest U.S. metro areas. This data allows you to get an idea of some of the housing affordability trends in your state or metro area.
So we first wanted to take a quick poll. Given the state of the economy, what would be your guess as to how the landscape of housing affordability has changed during this time period from 2010 to 2013? And we'll just pause for about a minute. We're interested to see what your guesses would be.
Thank you, everyone, for filling out our poll. So it looks like about 80% of you believe that housing affordability worsened between 2010 and 2013. So our data might actually surprise many of you. We found that the share of working households with a severe housing cost burden actually decreased slightly. We found that the share of working households with severe housing cost burdens in 2010 was 23.6%, and this fell slightly to 21.2% in 2013. So this decline indicates an improvement in housing affordability for working households, which is certainly good news. However, it still leaves a significant number of working households with severe housing cost burdens. In fact, more than 1 in 5 working households in 2013 was severely housing cost burdened.
As you might expect, working renters continue to be more severely housing cost burdened than working homeowners. The data that we looked at showed that as the demand for affordable rental housing has expanded, supply has not kept up. Renters have little to no control over their housing costs as rents rise with the expanding rental market. And the rental market is expanding there are a couple of different reasons for that. Two of the ones that we've considered are the rate of foreclosure among former homeowners after the housing bubble popped, and also households who have already been renting, wanting to make the leap to homeownership, but have not been able to, due to perhaps not being able to save enough for a down payment or not being able to access credit.
So the graph you see now gives an indication of why we saw the improvements in housing affordability in the previous slide. So looking first at working renters, you see that between 2010 and 2013, their median housing costs rose steadily by about 5%, while their incomes actually, their median household incomes rose a little bit faster by nearly 7%. And many of the improvements in housing affordability are due in part to modest increases in wages that increase household incomes of working households. And while this is a positive development for housing affordability in the data we looked at, we can't assume that wages will continue to outpace rents, particularly given the pressures in the rental market. Now, when you look to the right at working owners, you see why there were greater housing affordability improvements for them between 2010 and 2013. Among working owners, there was nearly a 7.5% decrease in median housing costs. At the same time, working owners saw over a 6% increase in median household incomes, which resulted in much greater improvements in housing affordability for these households.
So what that previous slide also begins to show is that the difference between the median housing costs for working owners and renters has shrunk. As you can see from this table, the difference has gone from $207 in 2010 to $91 in 2013. This is an interesting trajectory that we started to notice, because if it continues, and if policies promoting home buying among working households are strengthened, it could become much more feasible for working renters who want to become homeowners.
One of the new elements of Housing Landscape 2015 is an analysis of housing affordability for households by race and ethnicity. And you can see here that there is a great deal of variation in the data that we have. Except for working households headed by American Indians or Alaskan Natives, we found that working households headed by a person belonging to a minority race or ethnic group are more likely to be severely housing cost burdened than white-headed households. In fact, fewer than 20% of white-headed working households were severely housing cost burdened, while at the same time, about 25% of African American and Hispanic-headed working households had severe housing cost burdens. Asian and Pacific Islander working households face the greatest likelihood of being severely housing cost burdened, due in large part to their concentration in high housing cost regions like California, Hawaii, New York, and New Jersey.
As you can see from this graph, among working households, those with the lowest incomes are currently facing the highest rates of severe housing cost burdens. In 2013, nearly 80% of working households with extremely low incomes, that is 30% or less of the average median income, the area median income, are paying 50% or more of their income for housing costs. As you can imagine, that would have some pretty devastating impacts on those households with the lowest incomes.
What you see in front of you is a map of the U.S. that gives an indication of the variation in housing affordability challenges across the country. The darker colors in the states and metro areas correspond with the highest shares of severely housing cost burden working households in the states, as well as the 50 largest U.S. metro areas. And what you can see in this map is that states and metro areas and coastal regions and recovering housing markets appear to have the highest shares of working households with severe housing cost burdens, indicating that high housing costs and weak recovering housing markets pose real challenges to working households. The map also shows that while some states have moderate shares of working households with severe housing cost burdens, they may have greater affordability challenges in their large metro areas, giving a sense of some of the variation in housing affordability within a state. For example, at least 1 in 5 working households in New Orleans, Milwaukee, Seattle, and Virginia Beach are severely housing cost burdened, while Louisiana, Wisconsin, Virginia, and Washington, the states that these metro areas are located in, have shares of severe housing cost burdens that are below the national average.
In regard to policy implications, clearly there remains a strong need to increase the stock of affordable rental housing. That's been the case, but it's clearly getting stronger. With ownership costs decreasing and the gap between the costs of owning and renting becoming narrower, policies promoting homeownership for working households are starting to make more and more sense. And finally, local and municipal policies are where some real traction can be gained in increasing access to affordable housing. Policies having to do with land use, inclusionary housing, and tax credits to incentivize the construction of new affordable units become real beginnings of some solutions to the problem, and those are, again, best played out in the local arena.
Thank you, Mindy. Now, this is the point at the webinar where we are actually going to open up the webinar for questions from the audience, and you can submit those questions via the GoToWebinar toolbar. There should be a box labeled questions in front of you. And while you're all submitting your questions, I want to reiterate for those who may have missed the first few minutes of our webinar that we are recording this webinar, and we will email a link to the recording and the Housing Landscape Report to everyone who registered in the next few days. And at this point, we're happy to answer any questions you have about housing landscape and our analysis, as well as discuss any policies related to housing affordability that you may be curious about. So while we wait for some of the questions to come in, Mindy, do you want to give us a little bit of an explanation of, given that this is your first housing landscape project, some of the most interesting data that you came across in your analysis?
I too was surprised. I kind of thought, as our poll showed, I sort of would have, before looking at the data, would have assumed that the picture had worsened a bit as well. So I was encouraged by the sort of, the positive result that was seen in the overall sense. But, mitigated somewhat, again, by looking at the numbers, as we saw that the overall numbers of people with severe housing cost burden among working households have increased. So that was a little discouraging. But it was nice to see that there was some good news there as well.
Thank you. So we've got some great questions rolling in that we'll start to answer, and feel free to continue submitting your questions. The first question that came in was whether we were referring to gross or net income, And in our analysis, we do rely on gross income. We also have another question that came in about the effect of layoffs and unemployment among older households who are homeowners. So, Mindy, I'm going to toss this to you. We didn't actually examine unemployment in our research. As I mentioned in the beginning, we're specifically looking at working households. However, there are some challenges to homeowners when they do become unemployed. So one of the greatest challenges is obviously staying current on a mortgage as a homeowner when you have limited or no income coming in. So that posed one of the common reasons why many households may be facing foreclosure and might, as we saw in our analysis, transition from home ownership into renting. And this ties back to Mindy's point about some of the pressures in the rental market. As you have a huge increase in the number of renters, we also saw a corresponding decrease in the number of working owners. And a lot of this is related to working homeowners who faced foreclosure or who had to sell their home because it was unaffordable, as well as a trend that we saw in terms of working households that want to become home owners but cannot accumulate the wealth for down payment, even though they might be credit worthy.
Our next question has to do with the data. These data show improvement from the bottom of the recession. Did we compare this to pre-recession data? In other words, we may have improved, but have we regained what was lost during the recession? That's an interesting question. This particular report just focused on that span from 2010 to 2013, and the landscape started around during the recession, didn't it?
No, we've actually been doing housing landscape for several years, since early 2000s. However, we have changed our methodology in the report, and so our results from recent years are not comparable to previous versions of housing landscape. The next question that came in was a request to discuss some zoning best practices that support production of affordable housing.
And this we have actually another researcher on staff who kind of specializes in this and has published some interesting pieces on this. But looking at inclusionary housing, so housing that covers the needs for not just the people at the higher ends of the income bracket, but for working households as well. Land use policies as well, looking at zoning restrictions. What are there areas zoned for multifamily use, for affordable housing, things like that. Tax credit policies are found to be helpful as well, because these affordable housing units are often not self-sustaining financially. So if there are tax credit incentives made to developers to develop these kinds of units, that can go a long way as well to mitigate the cost.
The next question we have is whether, based on our study, it appears that homeownership has improved, but there's a question about what steps are being taken to improve lender underwriting without going back into subprime lending practices. So this is actually not something that we examined in our research. We didn't look at lending or underwriting. So we don't have any information about subprime lending practices since the recession. However, we do know from research completed by other organizations that one of the obstacles to homeownership for working households is actually accessing credit, as some lenders have become very strict about their lending criteria. So this is certainly a barrier to some of those households we talked about who want to become homeowners but are unable to at this point.
We have another question asking whether we looked at the population of people with disabilities. Another very fine question. This particular report, that does go beyond the scope of this particular report. Working households, that does encompass, of course, households with people with disabilities who are working. But in terms of people with disabilities who are on receiving Social Security or SSI, this report does not enfold that population.
We have a question about how we are evaluating the supply and demand of affordable housing and what statistics you're using. So in terms of just the supply and demand of rental housing, we've been referencing the work of other organizations. More explicitly, in our data, we certainly saw that between 2010 and 2013, there was a significant growth in the number of working renter households, indicating that this particular population is growing at a time when we also know that resources for creating or preserving affordable housing are still fairly limited. Our next question is whether Northern Virginia was included in the Virginia data. The questioner mentioned that HUD has some data stating that in the DC metro area, there's a high percentage of housing cost burden and extremely burdened renters. So Northern Virginia is included in the DC metro area that we looked at. So if you take a look at our report, and particularly in the appendix, you will see data not just for DC proper in the state section, but in the metro area section, you'll see the DC metro area data, which does include Northern Virginia.
And we have a question, are housing costs only counting rent and mortgage, or do they include utilities and other housing-related costs? They do include those other costs. They include, I know, utilities, and I believe that's it, just utilities and rent or mortgage payments.
For homeowners, it also includes self-reported mortgage insurance as well as taxes. So this estimate of median housing costs really is intended to be inclusive of all the housing costs that a household is paying every month. So it does include utilities, it includes property taxes and things like that, kind of typical housing-related costs. So at this point, it appears that we have exhausted all of the great questions that you have submitted. If you have any further questions, you have our contact information up on the screen, so you can reach either Mindy or myself, but we hope that you read through our report and follow up if you have any further questions. We will be sending a link to the webinar recording as well as the report in the next few days. Thank you so much, and thanks for joining us.